So Pete and I are from Breaking Forth. We are a VR studio based in London. We're going to talk about the future of storytelling. And where's the pointer?
Up above.
There we go. So, future of storytelling and storytelling in VR in particular. So, we're going to talk first about the past of storytelling, then a little bit at the present, and then the future. So taking it in a chronological order. Storytelling is in our nature. As some of you have probably heard from many of the previous speakers, there's lots of forms of storytelling that are out there. It's something that we as humans love to do, going back to before civilization, sitting around the campfire telling stories. As the previous speaker just said, in some ways, speech was the first virtual reality medium where you could picture something in your mind that somebody's told you without seeing it yourself. Okay, how do we get here? So I'm just going to talk about existing mediums for a minute. Where's, books, theater, movies, gaming, all storytelling mediums. I'm going to just talk about, there's really two ways that we can characterize all of the existing mediums on an axis. So first is passive versus active. Okay, most storytelling mediums out there now are passive. Okay, so this is TV, film, arguably books, and then active is really at this point gaming for the most part. Then we have framed versus unframed, and this is where it starts to get, I think, a lot more interesting. Framed is the television living through a window. It's flat, and crucially, the director has control. So you are, as the consumer of this narrative, you are letting yourself go, letting yourself be guided by the director, who you trust. Then we have unframed, content in all directions. The audience has control. So what does that mean? That's that's not really something that most of us are used to in the context of storytelling. But I'll get to that in a minute. So here's comparing them on an axis, active versus passive, framed versus unframed. So film or in TV, pretty uncontroversially, very framed, very passive. Sit back, watch the TV, watch the movie. Traditional theater, also framed. It's arguably slightly less passive because you as the viewer have the ability to focus on something different on different parts of the stage. You're not beholden to the director's exact view. Then we've got gaming. Different levels of activity here, activity versus passivity. Certainly recent years we've had things like walking simulators, which are arguably a little bit more passive. And then we have VR gaming. So it's very active and very unframed. So this is where the unframed starts to come in. Then we have something called immersive theater. And London has been on the forefront of immersive theater in recent decades. There's something called Punch Drunk. There are many other things, Yumi Bum Bum Train, all sorts of interesting things there. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But really, all of these mediums are kind of blurring together as technology advances. And gaming is now, and film are blurring, and there's a lot of overlap. So that's really interesting. So what about VR? What about VR narrative? This might be somewhat controversial, but we claim that it's here. VR storytelling. So we're claiming, at least the type of storytelling we are talking about that differentiates from gaming is going to be more passive, and it's going to be obviously unframed. What that means is that you as the viewer have agency, at the very least, of where to look. Okay, so that's where it is. Now, something interesting you see here, VR storytelling and immersive theater do have some overlap. So immersive theater, as I said, really big in London, or began in London in its modern form. Recent years has expanded worldwide. So what happens in immersive theater? The audience can look in any direction, move within the space. So what happens is they might rent out an entire warehouse that you can walk around, and there'll be a different scene in each room. Interact with people and objects to a limited extent, and explore more freely. Sound familiar? Well, to us it sounds a lot like VR storytelling, or at least how we conceptualize it. Okay, so where are we now? Just going to talk about Control. This is our shameless plug. Control is a 20-minute virtual reality drama that Breaking Forth put out in 2016. Let's see. Hopefully this will start. We've got a little quick trailer here.
This is it. We are in the closing stages of today's final. Can our final player snatch the crown from our current leader's fingertips? All firepower here from Liam. Shoot out!
I know how to win. This is my world. Here, I'm in control.
What are you grinning about, Liam? Well, you think you're clever, don't you?
So that's on the Gear VR, coming soon for Daydream and hopefully other platforms this year. So Control, as you can see, primarily CGI experience with some embedded video. We really like CGI. We think it's the most flexible medium right now for storytelling. And it allows us to create a fantasy world. In that case, you're inside a video game. So it's not a game, but it takes place inside a video game. It's a tournament that you are an observer in. So another thing, just a quick note, I mentioned Immersive Theatre, London being the epicenter of that. We really wanted to take advantage of London's creative resources, and we have a young playwright, Abraham Parker, who wrote the script for that, and certainly utilized some London-based actors. Okay, so really quickly about the audience. This is key for VR to understand this. You have to define your audience like never before. Who am I? And that means who am I, the viewer? Who am I? Okay, this question's pretty easy in existing mediums. Film, you're watching through a window. Gaming, you are the player, the protagonist. Theater, you observe from the seats, or maybe in immersive theater, you're wandering around. Virtual reality, question mark. So, does the audience belong in the space and do they have a purpose? This is, if you're creating a storyline in virtual reality, you have to always ask this question at the beginning, and you have to have a consistent answer. So one question or one possibility is that you are embodied. You as the viewer are in the space. You can look down and see arms, and we do this in Control. It won't necessarily always be the case that you will need to have a body, but it's one way of engaging the viewer and making it seem more immersive, but there are some limitations with it because everyone, if you're short or tall or male or female, what kind of body should you as the producer put in there? So we went with more of an abstract body that looks almost like a statue. But we found that people generally liked having a body. There's one part where your arm does move up, and we found that people, when they're watching it, instinctively move their arm up. So it adds to the illusion and the immersion, I think. So getting back to who you are. Okay, so one possibility is a natural spectator or a jury, student in a class, a witness, or an invisible observer, and this is when you don't really have a reason to be there, but you still think that it's worth viewing. So all these, you might note, they are passive observers. You are not the protagonist in any of these cases. We think that that's key to differentiate storytelling from gaming, and we think it's probably natural that you should be more of a passive observer. And then what can you do as the viewer? Can you move? Are you carried through on rails, which is something we used in Control, and we didn't make anybody sick as far as I know. So interact with characters and objects, influence the outcome. So again, we want to be careful not to make it a game if you're telling a story, and we think that there's a trade-off between too much interactivity and quality of narrative. And then the journey. This is really important. You're taking the viewer on a journey through a space. You're creating these amazing worlds. People want to explore them. People want to look around. You think about, in a movie, you have different scenes. In VR narrative, you have different worlds. So with every level, I felt like I was delving deeper into this world. That's just a quote from one of the viewers of Control. So we created multiple worlds. We gave people a chance to explore them. We kind of gave them a bit of a tour around each world before the storyline kind of resumed. And we thought that was really important, and people seemed to respond well to that. But again, the journey is very important to keep people's interest in the storyline. And so it is not only the journey of the character, it is also the journey of the audience. VR is an opportunity to take the audience to other worlds. So again, just to reiterate the point, you are probably a passive observer. There is also a protagonist who is different than you as the observer, and you really are following both journeys. So you are being taken on a journey as a viewer, and they are being taken on a journey as a protagonist, and it's interesting to see how they intertwine. And now we just pass it over to Pete.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks.
So I'm going to start by talking about what we learned when it came to direction within storytelling for VR. As Ken pointed out earlier, we took a lot of our learnings from the theatre, and especially immersive theatre. When we try and look at some of the techniques that you would use with film storytelling, you've got a lot of opportunities with close-ups, cuts and pans, and they're not things that you can really do naturally within VR. And part of that is it will break the immersion because they're not things that would tend to occur in day-to-day life. But that being said, there is definitely a lot of ways that we can direct their attention. I'm just going to talk about some of the techniques that we used within Control. First of all, lighting. So once again, coming back to theatre, we can direct someone's attention due to where we choose to have dark places, where we choose to have light, and direct their attention that way, whether that's spotlights or just natural looking lighting. Camera movement. So as Ken pointed out, we did have some on-rails scenes within Control, and we noticed with those that the audience instinctively tend to naturally look forward in those cases. So they could still look around, but primarily their attention was focused forward. Walls, corridors and doors. This is a really good one for if you want to get that sort of framed feel, make it a natural frame within inside the world, so you can have blocked out areas because you're looking down a corridor, which instinctively makes people look in one certain direction. Repeated imagery. Within Control, and you may have noticed it from the trailer that you saw there, we managed to have, to give you a bit of a background on the story, there's essentially Liam playing a computer game, but we also see a look into his real world. What we managed to do was have on the big screens multiple instances of that real world, which allowed the audience to look around, see what was going on within inside the computer game and feel like they weren't missing out on the other story that was taking place at the same time. This was a really good one because it just naturally made sense to have big screens in the real world, and it's best if you can do these methods in ways that it's not forced, it's kind of natural within inside that space. Character influence, something that's really important when it comes to characters and acting is whether their gaze is in a certain direction, whether they walk past the audience to lure their attention in another direction. And audio. Audio is huge, and this was something we spent a lot of time on within Control. It became really obvious to us from the start, having this multiple layers to our storyline, that it could be quite confusing to the audience member if not executed correctly. So if we talk about sound a bit more, to give an example, we had gameplay and sounds, we had the crowd commentary, the lounge room, which is what was Liam's real world, and the music. All of these things that had to come through just the headphones for the audience. So we separated these out, and we had a technique called binaural recording audio, which was more organic sounding, like naturally sounding for the lounge room, and then it was quite easy for the brain to know to distinguish that from what was happening in game world. This is a really key point and something that we've really been picking up more and more on as we are demonstrating this to people, is the fact that VR as a medium is kind of a selfish medium. You're expecting 100% of the attention of the audience. So unlike you'll notice, let me just see, yeah, if we look around the room, there's people that are on their phones as well as when you're watching TV, people are going to be on their phones. It's really hard to get 100% of someone's attention, but the moment you put on that headset, you put on headphones, they're blocking out the outside world. So as a director, as a storyteller in this space, you really have to give them what they deserve if they're going to take up 100% of their attention. So we said before about moving the audience in the space. So I'm just going to talk through some of these. Room scale VR, so if we're talking about Vive and more recently with what the Rift can do, the audience can move around to a certain extent within inside these spaces. It's a great way for them to get different perspectives with the story. You can take them on rails. This is something that's quite hard to achieve, especially in if you're filming live action 360 video, because there's a lot of challenges with getting it at the right speed, that it's predictable movement. We did all of our stuff with our movement with inside CGI, which meant we could do a few iterations and really refine it down to a point where we weren't getting nauseous results, but it is a challenge. As an alternative of the audience going to the action, bring the action to the audience. If you do need to cut, traditional fade is a very simple way to do it, but it is going to be a case of breaking the immersion. Teleportation, I mean this more in a sense of if you were doing a sci-fi story where you genuinely are trying to convince someone that they are teleporting from space to space, or you take them in a vessel, which could be a car, could be a spaceship, tank, anything like that. Or alternatively, and we've heard it here before, no movement at all. So you just choose consciously from the start not to have any movement. So what's next? I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about not what we've learnt, but now how we see this could be implemented into future productions, whether they're ours, whether there's other storytellers out there in the audience that want to take this on board. And it's an opportunity for us to question everything that's been done traditionally, what we can do with this new medium. And one thing that I'm really excited by is these open opportunities now for story structure. In traditional storytelling, you might have a linear narrative, a story arc. And when I say a linear narrative, it doesn't necessarily have to be chronological, but when you watch something, it is told the same way over and over. So you'd watch it twice. A good example might be Memento, Christopher Nolan film, where it's definitely not told in a chronological order, but it's definitely told the same way each time you watch that film. I'm going to start with parallel storytelling, and then I'll talk about some variations on that as well. So parallel storytelling, here we have your traditional character arc, but what if we were to introduce multiple character arcs that were all happening at the same time, and you as the audience member got to choose which parts you saw and which character you followed, or maybe bits and pieces of each. And this is once again coming back to what immersive theatre does really well. So here we've got one audience member who watches a bit of arc one, chooses to watch another one, and then finally comes back and watches the original conclusion. Another person might come and watch one the whole way through, but what we're seeing is we're getting a very different experience each time we watch this. What could also be interesting and make this far more interesting is when these storylines start to intertwine, and anyone who's either watched or read Game of Thrones can understand that these different character arcs are really interesting in this sort of situation. And by having a more complex intertwined web like this can be part of the mystery, and maybe you're trying to untangle them as you're going through watching what bits fit in with other storylines. So this is another variation on this parallel storyline, and it's very similar. You've still got these different character arcs or different storylines, but we might start with a specific one and tie it all together with a conclusion, the same conclusion, so that everything wraps up. And once again, something that's very common with immersive storytelling, immersive theatre. And the final one, which is quite a simple variation on the parallel one, is having a very linear structure, but within there having specific actions or events that happen that are simultaneous, and you can only see one of the two. And this is something you could do even with 360 video. You could have something that happens if you're looking this way, and at exactly the same time something else is happening that's behind you, and depending on which one of those two events you witness, you might have a very different experience to someone who watches the other one. So nonlinear storytelling. So unlike parallel storytelling, what I've got here are scenes, but they have not been put into any particular sequence. An audience member could choose to see any one of these scenes and then maybe go back to the central hub and then see other scenes. What makes this so fascinating, and I'd be really intrigued to see what storytellers are able to achieve with this, is once again these different experiences. You might have one person who comes in and they see a very sad first scene, and then by the end they see something very happy, and they might have a very different experience to someone who sees that in reverse. Taking this one step further, we can have that same idea of all of the information being given to somebody but in a different sequence, and then having this final conclusion, so you can have this summary however you want to execute that. And interactive storytelling, this is the last kind of example I'm going to give. Basically, there's two ways that we can look at this as well. So one might be that there's interactions within inside the space, but you don't influence the storyline. That's something that we're looking very closely at, and it's just to make it more immersive, more engaging within there. So examples of this might be able to study bits of props or something within inside the space, but you're not actually influencing the characters within there. The alternative would be something that has interactions, has events, and all of a sudden that's got a branching mechanism that then you end up having a lot of different outcomes off the back of that. This is very true to games and what you'd see with games, but not only games, it's also something that looks very familiar from anyone who's read a Choose Your Own Adventure book as well, so it's not tied down to any one medium. I'll just quickly go through some examples here. Multi-viewer, this is just really essentially to give an example that you can have numerous people watching the same thing, getting a different experience, and then part of the joy can be coming out and sharing that with each other. And I'm going to skip over the next one, but basically you get the same idea too. I already talked about this one. So finally I'm going to wrap up with some of the technology that's exciting. We're going to move into a space that's getting more realistic if people want to go with that rather than stylized. So this is an example from Metapixel. They do body scanning so you can get really realistic results, rig that up, and all of a sudden it's like you're in the same room with somebody else. Looking to make it more immersive with haptic devices, better resolution, makes it feel like you're really there, and all this room scale VR that's on the market. And then doing real-time performances. This really excites us for something for the future to watch out for, that potentially being able to have actors performing in one place around the world and having an audience from any side of the globe seeing it at the time that it happens. So that's the end of our time. Just to let you know, for ourselves, we're working on a couple of productions, 2 more productions about the same length as Control at the moment, which is going to be very exciting that you'll see later in the year. And I don't know if we've got time for any questions. Maybe one quickly if anyone has something. Right, we've got 3 minutes, Birdie tells me. Does anyone have any questions? Yep.
The question about earlier, when you were making a delineation between games and story.
Yeah.
The question is, why do you want to make that delineation?
Well, you know, it's true that there will be some overlap, or perhaps quite a lot of overlap. But we do feel strongly that, you know, if you think about the best movie or the best television show or the best novel you've ever read, you know, how it can really take you to someplace else, you know, really transport you. And it is very much a different experience, in our opinion, from an amazing game. Amazing game, you know, is great and fun for different reasons. And we believe that VR is really, outside of even its interactive elements, is really uniquely suited for this immersive, emotional, thought-provoking, you know, hyper realistic or perhaps hyper fantastical storytelling where you can engage multiple senses, show people something really amazing. So we think that there will definitely be opportunities to overlap, but we don't want to neglect kind of pure storytelling because we think VR is so great for it.
Have you played Her Story?
I didn't hear.
Have you played Her Story?
No, I don't know. I don't think so. No.
It's not a VR game.
Oh. Yeah. No. Anything else? Anyone else? Yeah.
Out the back there.
When you were making Control, because it's got both real film and animation in it, what was the #1 single biggest problem that you encountered as you were making it? Just one.
I'll take this one, absolutely. So basically the game itself is based on a kind of chess-style first-person shooter game. We decided to give it an authentic feel by giving those actual chess pieces an AI, a basic AI, to be able to play against each other. That became really good to get accuracy up to about 80% of what was going to happen with inside that game. But beyond that, to get it completely accurate was impossible. And so there's unpredictability that we were going to be able to have what the commentators were saying as part of the game, the story that was unfolding, be what was actually happening with the pieces. So we had to, what we ended up doing was using the best gameplay, but we were recording it out as a rendered version in the end.
Just to add something really quickly to that, as there were technical limitations making this for the Gear VR, which we think is a great product, but obviously it has technical limitations. We wanted the best graphics possible, and you know, we couldn't do that and also have it real-time rendered, so we did ultimately decide to do pre-rendered, which caused this problem that Pete was talking about. You know, as technology gets better, that will become less of an issue, but for now, in order to get the best graphics, we had to do that.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.